So now we're going to go over an example of how to create an IPO chart, and what you're going to see is how it breaks down to the actual operations that we do within our program. And this is going to help us organize our thoughts, hopefully, and be able to make our jobs a lot easier. So what we're going to do is we're just going to work our way through the columns from left to right. We're going to start off with the input column, and up here we see what's required of us in each separate column. And up at the top, we see the practice question that we're going to be using. Now, again, this is going to be kind of a run-on question that we're going to use for a lot of this design and professional practice section of the course. So the question is very simple. Create a program that asks the user for 3 test marks and calculates the average grade, which is then displayed to the user in a user-friendly format. This tells me every single thing I need to know as a programmer. So I know that I'm going to be asking the user for 3 test marks. So it asks the user for 3 test marks, which means I'm going to need variables for all 3 test marks. So what I'm going to do here is, as I stated before, that you're going to have 1 bullet point per variable. So I'm going to say mark 1 as a decimal value. Right? And oops, I should say mark 1. Mark 2 as a decimal value. I'm not sure why that one actually capitalized and the first one didn't. That's fine. And I'm just going to copy and paste this. Mark 3 as a decimal. Now, why decimal and why not an integer? Well, quite simply because later on in the question it says I'm calculating an average, and an average implies division. So I might as well use a decimal value to make sure that I have precision in my results. So that's all I'm going to have for my 3 variables at this point. I don't need to ask anything else from the user. I don't have any known data at this point. I could set up a constant value. I could create, let's say, num marks. Where did that go? Num marks as a decimal with value 3.0. And that way I have a known value which I can use in my calculations later on in the program. So this tells me what the value is and the name of it. So next we go into the processing section. And if you see here, describe what data processing is to occur here. First thing I should be doing is prompting and retrieving the input data. Now, because all this data is related, I can group this together in one comment. I could say ask for and retrieve the user, the 3 user entered test marks. Now, if the data was not related, I would need a separate ask for and retrieve statement for each piece of data. But these ones are known, or these ones are related. Now, I don't need to do anything for num marks because I know the value of that. So prompt and retrieve bullet point, done. Describe and define any variables for calculation. Well, I'm calculating an average. An average implies 2 things. Or you calculate the average and very simply using the sum of the marks divided by the number of marks. Well, that implies that I'm going to need a variable for the average itself as well as for the sum of the marks. So I'm going to create 2 bullet points here. Sum as a decimal, and average, I'm going to just say AVG as a decimal. Now I've described and defined my variables for calculations. Next thing, I need to perform the actions required. Alright, so I need to calculate the average, but the average is the sum divided by the number of marks. So I need to calculate the sum first. So I'm going to write calculate sum as mark 1 plus mark 2 plus mark 3. Now I need to calculate the average. Calculate average as sum divided by num marks. You notice that there's no magic numbers here. Even in my general design, I still don't have any magic numbers. Everything has its purpose. I'm just going to space this out a little bit just to make it a little bit easier to read for when I go to transfer this into my actual program. So at the top here I have my input section. Over here I have my storage for my variables, and down here I'm doing the processing. and of course storage as well. And finally, I'm done with the processing because I don't have any other actions. I have one bullet point per piece of processing. Finally, we go to our output section, and it says display the average grade in a user-friendly format. Again, what does user-friendly mean? It needs to be descriptive yet concise. Don't waste space, no fluff or anything like that. Just tell the user what the results are, but make sure that it's clear what you're telling them. For me, I'm going to say display the average test grade is plus AVG. And that's it. I'm all done. There's my complete IPO chart. Just going to move this down a little bit. There's my complete IPO chart. Now, if I were to go to program this, I would start in my input column. First thing I'd do is I'd create 3, depending on the language. Let's assume I'm working in Java or C# or something like that. The decimals would be double values, right? So I'd create 3 double variables. Nummarks, again, is a double, and it would have the starting value of 3.0. Over in the processing section, let's get rid of that. In the processing section, I would have to prompt the user for each mark, depending on what type of program it is. Again, sometimes that might be a label, sometimes that might be a console command, some type of console output. Of course, I'm still going to need 2 more variables defined. These variables aren't defined in the middle of nowhere. They are defined with all the other variables, depending on where you did this. Probably local data in this example, but who knows, maybe global, depending on the rest of your program. So these would be defined in the same place that these would be defined. Just because it's done here in the processing section does not mean that you move where they're actually placed. Right? We still have our program structure, and our program structure says our variables need to be defined together at the top of our code block. And then finally, our calculations. 2 lines of calculations, calculating the sum and then calculating the average using the sum and the nummarks previously defined. And finally, 1 last line of code. I would take this display command, and again, depending on the language you're dealing with, if you're dealing with Java, it might be system.out.println. If you're dealing with C#, it might be a console.writeLine. If you're dealing with a form window or something like that, it might be a label or a message box. It depends on how you're doing it. And that's it. That's our entire program using an IPO chart. And we're going to try this again with the next setup of design, which is well, that depends on the course. It's either going to be flowcharts for the younger grades, and it'll be pseudocode for the later on grades.